Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on EV charging hubs. I'm glad you could join us. My name is Chris Brennan, and I'm the Marketing Events Executive for MER UK. We would like to start off with an apology. Obviously, last week we were due to have the webinar on Wednesday. Unfortunately, due to circumstances completely out of our control, we had to reorganize it. So I would like to again say thank you for joining us today on the rearranged day. I'm hoping that we have all of our speakers online. I can see we're all joined today, but I'll give them a quick introduction. So we have with us Jason Holden, who is the partner at XProp. We have Liz Warren, who's our Director of Public Charging, and we also have Tim Johnson, who is our Head of Public Sales. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
Oh, and here we go, the first one with the microphones. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. Brilliant. That's excellent news. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll get going straight away. And what we'll do is just have a quick look at what's on the cards for today. So we're going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to hand over to Liz for our introduction to the webinar to kind of set the scene and let you know what we're going to be talking about today. And then we're going to go into the main session with both Tim and Jason and kind of discussing EV charging hubs, all kind of elements of it, looking at what we need to consider and kind of what the pitfalls are. And then at the end, there will also be time for some Q&A. So we'll go through that in just a second. So just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on demand later on today, hopefully via YouTube channel, via our website. So we will have appropriate links, and you'll also get a link to it via email following the event. And as I discussed, the Q&A session at the end, at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you should see a chat function. So I understand that during events like this, you can get questions come to your head and you want to get them out before you forget them. Please feel free to pop them into the chat and we will kind of bring it all together at the end. So for the moment, that's my part done. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce and hand over to Liz Warren, our Director of Public Charging. Good morning.
Good morning, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Brilliant. Good. Okay, cool, because I can't see anything. So fantastic. It's hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. It really is great to see so many of you here. And again, apologies for last week. As Chris said, I'm Liz Warren and I run our sales and operation team in MER Charging. I'm here to give you a bit of background to the charging market, and whilst I'm doing so, I will briefly touch on some of the topics that Tim and Jason will discuss shortly, a bit of a hint, so to speak. Give me just 2 seconds while I just rearrange my screen, because I think I've gone into presenter mode, which is fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. And then, excuse me, guys, while I just hopefully get rid of that. Perfect. Now I can see what I'm doing. Okay. Chris, I don't see. Oh, no, I've done it. Perfect. Okay, so first up, why are we all here? Well, for me personally, and I would argue for most people in the world right now, a major issue we all face is climate change and how to reduce our impact on the world around us. Importantly, the changes we make need to be done in a sustainable and achievable way for the world of business. Right now, business and landowners face ever-increasing requirements to meet ESG goals, and transport makes up a quarter of UK greenhouse gas emissions. And over the past 5 years, ESG targets have moved from a nice to have to a must have, having an impact on property value now and in the future. With ESG scoring based on resource use, emission reduction and innovation, installing EV charging on your land is a straightforward way to meet these goals, whilst also bringing in additional revenue from land you've not previously leased. So let's move on to market opportunity and what additional revenue could be brought to your land. Well, right now there's 1.1 million BEVs, that's obviously battery electric vehicles on the road, estimated to grow to 9 million by 2030. This is a market that's growing fast, and it really will be huge. Right now, we have 60,000 public charge points installed. We're estimating another 48,000 more are needed to maintain coverage, and I think that estimation is conservative. Most of those 48,000 will need to be rapid or ultra rapid, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. As an EV driver myself, and after extensive market research, we know that EV drivers want to charge at hub locations, not single site installs. At a hub, the driver is more likely to be able to charge immediately. And at the same time as charging, and very importantly, visit shops and cafes. Coffee and toilets are a key location KPI for the average EV driver. I mentioned just now about charger types. I'll just skip on to the next slide. Just a short introduction to what I mean. Charging is most easily split into two types. You've got slow AC chargers around 22 kilowatts and rapid stroke ultra rapid DC chargers, which are over 50 kilowatts. We're now seeing rapid chargers going up to 400 kilowatts. And whilst right now only a small number of cars can utilize the full power available, we expect the demand for these high power chargers to increase significantly over the coming years. AC charging is generally more relevant for a longer stay destination if you think theme parks or workplaces, whilst DC is ideal for retail parks and garden centres with a shorter dwell time, but still a requirement to shop, eat, drink, or very importantly, use the loo. So going back to the charging hubs, what are the easy wins and challenges for landlords looking to offer this solution to their customers or your customers? Tim and Jason are going to go into this in detail next, but a very high level easy wins are around if you're the first installer, you'll attract business first and you're likely to get that repeat visit in the future. Drivers want convenient locations near to main roads with easy access, and there's the potential to attract fleet, taxi, blue light, particularly the police, throughout the day, throughout the 24 hours. And how about the challenges? Well, there are quite a few, and Tim and Jason will definitely go over this. Building the right size of install is a key factor. Too small, when you have queues. Too big, and your parking bays are underused. Getting the install over the line, this is a big one. Here in the UK, we have a number of hoops to jump through, from planning, lease license agreements, DNO, land rights, grid connections. The list really does go on. And finally, getting that balance between EV charging only bays and bays for general use. Before I hand over to Jason and Tim to discuss these points in detail, I did want to flag one final point. I shall skip on to that beautiful slide. Quite relevant today, in particular. Obviously, the political landscape right now, there's a lot going on, and the outcomes are likely to be significant one way or another. The point of today isn't really to discuss this in detail, but we do have a blog that we've published on this recently, and we're going to put that into the chat. Already done. Brilliant. We're closely monitoring events. We remain very optimistic for the future. What an exciting day for all of us today. And with all of that, I'll hand you back to Chris. Thanks again for joining. Please pop any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll be happy to discuss them.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for that great introduction. And so now, yes, we move on to the kind of main course of the event. And now we're going to be speaking to Jason Holden, the partner at XProp, and Tim Johnson, our head of sales. So Jason, I'll come to you. Welcome and thank you for joining us. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Very different, because I know last week when we were scheduled, you got up at 5 a.m. to do this because you were in New York. So thank you for the dedication. I'm glad that we can do it at a more sociable time for you this time, which works out nicely. So I think to begin with, Jason, could you give us a little bit of background into who XProp are and what exactly you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a partner in a niche practice that specialises in the retail warehouse sector. We've got a team of 10 surveyors, a Leeds office and a London office. We've got a team of investment surveyors that buy and sell retail park assets on behalf of institutional landlords. And we've got a team of agents that specialise in the occupational side, advising many of the landlords out there, and also a raft of tenants on acquisitions and disposals. And that's where I sit in that team. And we partnered up with Statkraft 4 or 5 years ago, using our contacts and address book to extend and expand their network into retail and leisure parks.
Excellent. So to say you're an expert in the space would be putting it lightly, I would say.
I see there might be a couple of experts out there in the audience, so I'll use the expertise word inverted commas.
Brilliant. Okay. And at this point, I think we'll bring in Tim as well. Good morning, Tim. How are you?
I'm very well, Chris. Good morning, everybody.
Fantastic. Tim, I think a good place to start really is to discuss kind of the bones of what an EV charging hub is and why should landowners be installing them. So where do we start? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start, and I'm going to start really where Liz left off, because I think that's a good place to go. So forgive me if I'm telling the audience parts that they know, but I think it's important to understand what we mean by rapid charging and fast charging. So to put this into real life context, if you've never driven an EV before, you've never done this, how does it work? Because I know there are horror stories about, oh, it takes forever to charge these cars and they're not great and they only do 10 miles and all this sort of good stuff. So there is a fundamental difference between fast charging and rapid charging, and it's a terrible analogy or word to use as fast, because fast is actually slow. So this is AC charging. This is the type of charging that connects directly to your household or your business, and it's designed for that long dwell time. So it's designed for that. I typically say to people, 3 hour plus stop. This is really what you should be looking at, because putting it in too fast when you're trying to do a long stop becomes a problem. Imagine having a charge that's done in half an hour and you're halfway through a film, you're sat in the cinema and you need to leave to unplug your car. Whereas rapid charging is designed for, it can be as quick as 5 minutes, but it can also be, we can play with that timing to make it more of an hour to an hour and a half. So I think it's really important to understand what we're talking about when we talk about rapid hubs. And what is a hub versus a single charger? What do we mean by that? And again, the picture is a fantastic illustration. So the charger in the picture, because I'm very sad, I've been in this industry a long time, is an Alpitronic charger. That is typically what we consider a single charger installation. So if there was just one of these on the site, which is what happened in the early days, and that was really to do with fast rollout, it was to do with the capabilities of the car at the time being maximized at 50 kilowatts as their rapid pace. But as Liz mentioned, we're now into the 300-400 realm. We're much bigger in terms of the pace, making it faster. Again, looking at it when it first started, putting in that single isolation charger versus now, there's a lot more cars on the road. So we need to account for those cars and we need to account for those drivers coming in. When we talk about putting a hub in, and certainly when Jason and I talk about this, we look at what's on site. What's the likely dwell time? Is the site mainly fast food restaurants and coffee shops? In which case we're going to go super high power if it's available. So we're going to look at 300 and 400 kilowatt charging. We're probably going to put in 3 of these chargers, which would allow for 6 bays. It means the drivers can come in. They'll be done in anywhere between 5 to 15 minutes, depending on their car's capability, battery state, and their requirement. And that's really what we're looking at. And so from a landowner's perspective, it suddenly becomes this additional draw to the site to bring these drivers on. Not only are they offering this sort of stop anyway with the setup of let's use a retail park as an example, where they've got somewhere to eat, somewhere to get a coffee, you're now also giving that driver, that person, another reason to come and stop, because it just adds to what you're already offering that individual.
Right. Okay. So we've kind of had an overview of looking at the charging types, but what about the different bay types? So obviously, they've got various things to consider here with the different kinds of bays. What should they be looking at when landowners are looking at how to distribute their bays across the car parks?
Yeah, again, really good point to look at. And this does come down a little bit to space. So, sort of talking more to the landowners of the retail park, they've got things to consider, like no build zones. There might be demised, non-demised spaces within that where they're restricted on the number of bays that they can forego to EV charging. In an ideal world, us here at Mer, especially, we're looking at slightly oversized bays. So a good example of that is we would take around 3 bays of normal standard parking to make 2 EV spaces. So you would lose, it'd be a net loss of 1. But part of the reason we do that, and again, using this illustration that's up on screen, you can see the cables are thick, they're heavy, and depending on the car that you're driving will depend upon where that charge point connects to on the car. Might be on the back, might be in the back bumper, some of them are in the grille, some are in the front wing. So there's this piece for EV drivers that making it easy, making it safe is really important. So having a walkway through the middle where the driver can stand while someone else is pulling in. If you think back to a traditional, again, using a retail park as an example, I know when I go to retail parks, often the spaces are quite thin. My car isn't oversized by any stretch, but they are pretty thin. And if there's someone next to me, you open the door just enough to sort of get yourself out. Imagine being stood in that space and trying to connect a charger while someone's reversing in. There's a safety aspect to consider there. Mm-hmm. With that said, if the spaces on site are restricted, there is a requirement to put EV charging in. We've done some installations in the past where we can mount the charger on a green space if there's a bit of green space. So like this, for example, we may look to, we could take the fence out of the back, we could level that ground and sit the charger behind so that we don't need to extend the bays. Our best practice would always be to do that. But again, we want to work with any landlord to ensure that we're adhering to what they need and what they have to spare, as well as making it the best experience for that driver.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, just to bring you in now, I think obviously when considering the kind of the bay scenario, it's probably not something that comes to the forefront of a developer's mind when they're looking at these kind of things. And there must be a lot of other common misconceptions around the process of installing EV charging. So in your interactions with clients, kind of what have some of those misconceptions been?
I think there are many. I think the one that sits on the top of the table from my point of view, acting for landlords that want to install EV charging, but also working with Mer, is the length of time that it takes to get from the initial conversation to an electrified bay on site. Most landlords think, well, it's a simple process. It's just a plug on a car parking bay. It's an existing bay. Why is it taking so long? But there are many aspects of that process. Planning, which is out of control of the charge point operator. There's the DNO to deal with, and they're a law unto their own. It's a very slow process, making applications, understanding power. Is the power there? If it is, can we apply for it? What's the cost? And then there's also not a misunderstanding, but a misconception that because it's not a bricks and mortar building, typical to a standard retailer, the charge point operator is still selling power, and therefore they need that legal protection through the lease, similar to a retail park occupier or a standard tenant. So those are the sort of the biggest misconceptions, and a couple of others. It's there are many charge point operators out there. It's been referred to as the Wild West, and it's a misconception that the highest rent per bay is the one to go for. Then you need to understand, what are you getting for your money? Some operators are able to afford to pay a higher bay rent because they're putting in lower grade hardware. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask yourself, is that charge point operator going to be around in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time? So there is a misconception that many of these charge point operators grabbing space will still be around in the future.
Mm-hmm. And is that obviously we kind of operate on an open charge point protocol. That's obviously something that's important to consider. So say, for instance, one of these EV companies does come in and then is no longer around in a couple of years. Somebody needs to be able to come in and kind of take control of that charger for the landowner.
That's correct. And Tim, I don't know whether you want to add on to that, what the sort of mechanisms and how simple or difficult that process may be.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'm desperately trying not to make this into a sales pitch, so forgive me if I keep sort of stopping myself. Yeah, I think it is a really good point to talk about, touch on a few of the things that you've spoken about, Jason. So I think you're right. There is a lot to consider in this industry right now. There are a lot of people seemingly offering the same thing. And in fairness, in a lot of it, there is some similarities, both in terms of the charging and what the functionality actually is, i.e. charging an electric vehicle. OCPP compliance, which stands for the Open Charge Point Protocol, is effectively, to give people an insight into this, imagine this is a bit like having an unlocked mobile phone. So we as Mayor are your network provider, and should there ever be an issue with us or another CPO, you want your chargers to be on that OCPP compliant basis. It effectively means in reality, you can go and take the SIM card out, someone else can put a new SIM card in, and then the functionality returns to the charger via another operator. Again, it's, as Chris mentioned, we adhere to that. Everything we install is part of that. We don't wish to lock anybody in to us. We want you to stay with Mayor, of course we do. But equally, we understand that this is something that it's really a big function on your site, and important that it works. I think that's sort of the question. Sorry, I got sort of sidetracked myself.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, obviously, one of the big concerns for landowners at the moment is the current state of the market surrounding EVs. And obviously, we've said kind of early doors today that we're not getting into kind of the political landscape and what that could mean moving forward. But obviously, we've got the public perception to kind of work against, whichever way you want to see it, because a lot of the public are still actively against buying EVs. Tim, is this likely to change the landowners' opinions on installing EV charging?
I think, yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think we've seen, talking from experience with Jason and I, it's a real mixed bag. And talking from my own experience of going and sitting and pitching to different types of landlords or businesses through the years that I've done this, there is definitely a big fundamental shift towards the acceptance of EVs, and in some cases actually pursuing EV charging on their site. I'm personally seeing a lot more inquiries that are just coming to our door now, where people are saying we're really interested in doing this. But it would be remiss to say that there are people that are against this if we said that there weren't. And I think it's a lot of misconception. I think there's a lot of noise surrounding this change. I mean, ultimately, it's a very human thing to not want change to happen. Certainly when it's something you're very comfortable with, it's a process that my dad did, his dad did before that, and family back and back and back in terms of how to refuel a car. It's very simple. Go to a fuel station, fuel up and leave. And actually what we're talking about, and I think is important to highlight, is that process is changing to a degree. For me, I've driven an EV now for about 3 years. I do the majority of my fueling at home, but when I'm on the go, there's an opportunity to charge because it's convenience, because I'm heading to those shops, I will take it. And certainly on a long run, exactly as Liz mentioned earlier, if there is that sort of utopia where it's like, oh, I really need to grab some lunch, or I want to stop and have a coffee, I've got some emails to do because I'm working, or I'm just with the family and actually want to stop and stretch our legs. If I can do that in an area where there's interesting things to do, I will do. For example, done journeys where I've got a spare hour. Oh, fantastic. I'll stop here. I've had a look around the shops, end up spending a bit of money. And again, we've actually got data to prove that incidental spend does happen through drivers who sometimes even weren't intending on getting a coffee, but they suddenly look around and go, well, there's a Starbucks or a Costa or a Nero over there. I'm going to go and get something to drink whilst I'm here because it makes it, convenient. And we need to remember as well that these stops, as I mentioned, can be as short as 5 minutes. I remember doing a journey back from Leeds. I lived down in Hampshire, drove all the way to Leeds, did my meeting, was on the way back. I plugged in. By the time I'd walked from the charger to the coffee shop and back, and I timed it just out of interest, it was 7.5 minutes, and I'd managed to get 150 miles on my car in that time. So it was enough to or more than enough to take me home. So again, just to sort of put it into reality.
Yeah. And I think, obviously, Jason, you'll probably have encountered this of clients coming to you to kind of test the water for installing EV charging, but still slightly apprehensive about it. So, are they still coming to you with those kind of questions, those worries?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, with the ESG and GRESB criteria hot on most institutional landlords' agendas, the green topic is very much top of the list. So a lot of them want to get in there early and get the installation so that they've got what their customer wants on retail parks, and others are not so sure, sitting back, waiting for a little bit of time to pass on these installations so that they can learn from other people's mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you mind if I step in on that really quickly? And I think that's a really good point Jason's raised. One thing that I will absolutely say is first mover advantage in this industry is massive. EV drivers are very much creatures of habit. If they find a decent location that works, it's on their regular journey, that's the one they will just continue to go to. So that is definitely something to consider as a landlord. Is first mover advantage is big in this world.
Yeah.
But also to just take on from that, Tim, a town can get saturated very quickly with cannibalization, and if you're not a first mover and you don't put the installation on a retail park, and other retail parks surrounding and other properties in the immediate vicinity will have them, and therefore that knocks the viability of the installation on your scheme, and therefore it might not have it, and therefore people will go to other locations, similar to when Wi-Fi was a big thing in shopping centres and retail parks a few years ago. If you don't have it, people will go elsewhere. So you miss out on those customers that are being attracted to your scheme.
Yeah. And I think kind of going on something that Tim just discussed, obviously additional revenue is becoming an increasing incentive for landowners, and they want to make sure that they're getting their money's worth. But obviously, the first steps around getting the infrastructure correct and installed can be quite expensive across the board. So Jason, kind of what do we need to look for in terms of financial models that would suit these types of installations?
Well, I think there's two key parts to that question. One is how is the hardware and the infrastructure installed and who pays for it? And the second part of that is how does the landlord benefit from that installation? Mm-hmm. So I think the first part of that question is how is the in a lot of locations quite a significant outlay for the installation, including substations in many locations when you're looking at ultra rapid hubs, is how can that be paid for? And there are, I think, simply, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but three simple solutions. One is you can buy the kit, the landlord can buy the kit themselves, install it and run it, and take all the money from the margin on selling the power themselves. The second one is, which is the most common and attractive to landlords, is the fully funded option, whereby the charge point operator pays for all the installation, the power upgrade, which is separate from the power that goes into the hard, bricks and mortar property, the point of connection, the hardware going into the location, and the only cost to the landlord is the legal costs on the landlord side, which is in most cases relatively low compared to most property transactions. And there's a hybrid solution in between, whereby the landlord can choose to buy the hardware and get a charge point operator to install it and run it on their behalf. So you've got a number of different options there. And on the how's the landlord remunerated, there are a couple of options there as well. There's a share in the percentage profit, whether that's gross or net is to be agreed, or there is a bay rent, which most landlords go for because it gives certainty. You can put an income line on their spreadsheets and you can capitalize that, and that creates the value, whereby a hypothetical turnover percentage, net profit, gross profit share is harder to value from their point of view. And there's a combination of the two, the higher of a bay rent or a percentage of the net or gross profits.
Mm-hmm. And kind of looking at that, because obviously with the kind of the initial outlay, you know, being able to move forward with this as well. So we talked about not standing still and being the first to adopt these kind of things, but you've also got to be ready to kind of expand upon it within the future. So we've kind of, what about future proofing, Tim? Because obviously, you know, we may think that they want to start small, but what considerations need to be kind of considered to make, to, you know, ensure growth is feasible?
Yeah, no problem at all. So this is a really good point, and I think there's two elements to this in terms of future proofing. So one is future proofing in terms of having enough chargers for demand. The second is future proofing in terms of you know, the technology moving forward. So in terms of from a demand perspective, what we can do, and again, desperately trying not to turn this into a sales pitch, but we have ways and means of being able to sort of capture an amount of power. As Jason mentioned, one of the key steps in this is ensuring we have enough power to supply what we want to do. You know, it's huge amounts of power that we need for these chargers. The good thing about retail parks is they're situated right on main roads. That's typically where the HV power lines run within the UK. So it does make them really convenient in terms of installation perspective as well. So what we can do is we can look at the site itself. As Liz said, too many and you've got dead bays, too little and you've got queuing. So we can look at it and go, okay, we know from experience that the minute you put an EV charging installation in, you're going to get demand. The longer it sits there, the more that demand will increase. So what we can do is we can already install all of the ducting and requirements. So we have a setup whereby effectively these chargers lock into a plinth in the ground. So we can, as part of the initial installation, let's say we're going to do 2 chargers, 4 bays, but we could set up so that it's ready to then accept another 1 or 2 chargers or more. So we'll have all the ducting in place. We'll have the sort of the lockable caps in the ground. As the landowner, all you will see is a very small circular metal disc on the floor. So you won't even notice that it's there. All of this is completely underground, been tarmacked over and just looks like the normal site. As demand increases, we can then turn up on site. We pull the cables through the existing ducting to connect that to all of our electrical equipment, tell our supplier that we now need the demand that we've already ring fenced in the first instance, and we can install 2, 3, however many more chargers, and suddenly have more bays in the space of 2 to 4 days rather than, you know, 3 to 4 weeks coming in and then having to do all of that civil work again. So we have that within our mindset, and we talk to a landowner about that. We would love that, because from us, it's brilliant. We have great case studies of retail parks that have had to increase as quickly as 6 months because we've seen huge demand. Brilliant. The top right hand corner is case in point. So the chargers to the back were installed first. So the ones with their backs to us in the picture, within 6 months, we had to then go and install these additional 3 because demand just flew. And these are actually now at a point where demand is sort of maximized again. A really interesting bit of data on this. What we expected was, we saw the demand, the chargers were maxed out on the right. We thought we'll put more chargers in, demand is going to fall off and it will eventually rebuild. I think demand hit peak again. I think it was within 8 months of us installing and putting live the chargers on the left, which is unbelievable when you consider that's then doubled its usage. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is an installation like we have in the top left. So we can use dynamically load balanced equipment. So you'll notice a unique difference between how the chargers look. The chargers on the right are what I call traditional type chargers. They're static load balancing. In other words, one of those chargers, let's say, for example, has 100 kilowatts going to it. If one of the guns is connected to a car, that car will get 100 kilowatts. The minute a second car connects to the other gun, irrespective of what the car is taking, the charger will automatically put 50 to both cars for the whole time they're connected. So it's brilliant having a charger. It's not the best driver experience in terms of the car, let's say on the left might be fully charged, but the car on the right still won't get that power because that's just how the charger's programmed to work. On the left, this is one of the latest things we've seen. You've probably seen a lot of these type of installations by a number of different CPOs because this equipment is very intelligent. Behind the fence in the background is basically where the power sits. So we have like a huge, almost looks like a telephone box or double-sized telephone box sat behind that fence. That's where all the power goes. and it comes to these satellites that are set up in a line. This is able to monitor each of those sockets actively and continuously. And to put charging in simple context, it works in a profile of top to bottom. So if a car comes in, it's got 1% left, it will charge at its maximum capability. As that battery fills up, the charging will slow down, just because Elon actually described this in the best way. It's like, imagine going to a car park where there's no cars in the car park and you've got one car. You're going to zoom in and pull into a space. It's going to take you 2 seconds. Now imagine going to that same car park later on and 90% of the spaces are full. You're going to drive around it slowly until you find a space to park. Battery works in the same way when it's charging. So the charge pace just slows down. This system takes advantage of that, and it will go, gun 6, that car's nearly full. I've now got a spare 20 kilowatts. Who needs it? And it will be able to communicate with the cars and then give it to the car that needs it most. So this is a really intelligent way of using a limited amount of power to a site. Mm-hmm. So that's answering that question around how we can grow it or use that power. The other big question in this industry is isolation or obsolescence, of the technology. What I will say, I've been in this industry for 6 years. When I first started, there was a big question around what's going to grow quicker: fast charging, AC, rapid charging, DC. Because when we came into this industry, all cars charged at 7 kilowatts on an AC and 50 kilowatts on a DC. And then Tesla came out and they did 22 kilowatt AC charging. So did some others. But what we've seen is a massive drive towards DC, just the battery technology just getting better and being able to take more power, 250, 350 kilowatt charging in 2 minutes. You know, you keep seeing these things coming up in news feeds of this car can now charge in 2 minutes, 1 minute. It's getting faster and faster. So it's driving in the DC area. We've also seen a real consolidation of the socket types. When I started, there were 3 different types of DC sockets. There was a CCS, there was a CHAdeMO, and there was a Type 1. Type 1's disappeared. We're seeing vast majority now going to CCS connectors. In fact, you'll see on the guns in the picture on both sides, most are CCS. So that one with a big handle, and then you've got one with a white socket. If you look at the picture in the bottom, you can just about make it out in the middle. A gun that's a white color, that's a CHAdeMO connector. That traditionally was French and Japanese cars. But again, to give you some reassurance of how this is changing, the Renault Zoe, which was one of the first electric vehicles to really come out and really push hard to get into this market, they used the CHAdeMO connector in that first car. Very, very popular EV. It was #1 for a long time. In fact, I think it only got knocked out by the Model 3 just because it was a more popular looking car. The new Renault Zoe has moved to a CCS connector. So we're seeing this drive. So I think we're out of the woods in terms of obsolescence of chargers. As long as they've got that CCS connector, which they all offer, it's then just about the power that a driver wants. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not always about having the fastest charger on your site. It's about having the right pace of charger for what your site is doing. You don't always want a 400 kilowatt charger on your site if you've got a cinema. So I think we're getting to a really comfortable place where all AC charging now is pretty much Type 2 socket. All DC charging is CCS. It's just about getting the right amount of power.
Mm. So kind of pivoting a little bit to look at the actual kind of the installation process and everything that goes before. I think, Jason, there's a number of pressure points to consider, and a lot of people often consider the civil works that Tim touched on, the digging of the ground, the actual physical getting the kit in there. They consider those to be the pressure points, but would we be right in saying that the majority of these happen actually before the installation process?
100%. I think once you're on site with a spade in the ground, then the hard work's being done. And I think those pressure points, going back to the initial conversation, happen well before the spade, any spade goes in the ground. And those are mostly related to the power piece in terms of that application process. And once you've got heads of terms agreed and you're ready to go, most charge point operators have already made a power application, so they know that there is a power available and it's at an affordable price to enable them to move into the next stage. But one thing I will say on power while I'm talking about it is potentially you have to apply for power on behalf of any landlord with a letter of authority. There are a number of charge point operators out there that apply for power without authority from the landlord. And once you allow a charge point operator to do that, they join the front of the queue, they apply for power, they obtain the power, and it's theirs. It doesn't belong to the landlord. So therefore, any competing charge point operator that wants to get in there, you take out the competitive edge, because you've given the authority, well, not the authority, but you've given the advantage to that particular charge point operator at the outset. So be careful when someone says, don't worry, I can apply for power, let me crack on. Just be careful, because you lose control at that stage. And I think the next stage, once you move in to the heads of terms and the sort of lease or license process, is that process can take a huge amount of time because of the misconceptions that we talked about at the beginning. It's a proper company selling power. They're retailing, and therefore they need protection. And there are a lot of things that we found are coming out of that legal process. And just to run through a few things to watch and hurdles to think about is flexibility. Does the landlord have flexibility within that lease? Because you might have a retail park or a property that has leases coming to an end in 5 years' time, but he's granted a lease to an EV charge point operator that is 10 or 15 years. Can he get early termination? And there's a lot of to and fro in negotiations about that flexibility, whether it's lift and shift, whether there's an early termination provision, and can the charge point operator terminate the lease? And we've had an example where we're selling a retail park, and the last point outstanding was that the charge point operator can terminate the lease at any time. They can wake up in the morning, don't really fancy it, give notice to the landlord, terminate the lease, and there is a compensation payment predetermined in the lease that the landlord has to pay the charge point operator on a predetermined amount, which was in this instance a huge amount of money. So there's lots of nuances and traps that you need to be careful about. Also, the insurance around what's insured, who insures what happens if a lorry drives through and takes out all the charge points on site. Is there a rent suspension? These things, are there to protect the charge point operator, but many landlords don't think about it because it's a simple plug in the ground. They don't feel that there is a need to protect what is effectively their tenant. So there's been a lot of toing and froing in my experience and Tim's experience around these critical points from a landlord's point of view and from a tenant's point of view. Right.
I think this is probably a good time to kind of move into potentially the Q&A session, because we've got some good, interesting questions coming in from the attendees here today. So I think if we start having a look at them, because I think they're very much in line with what we've just been discussing. So how do landlords choose between CPOs when there are very little differences between the top 5 to 10? So I think we've got quite a biased view on this, Tim, at Mayor, I think. So I think maybe Jason could have a look at this one for us. So what do landlords need to look at to choose between the CPOs?
I think you're right. The sort of the top 5 to 10 that are here for the long term, there's very little to choose between what they're offering, what kit they're putting in, and what bay rent they're paying. But I think the driver, not, as Tim said, not trying to sell Mer, is the green credentials. In my experience, the green piece and sustainability from Mer is outstanding. It's the only charge point operator that complies with the science-based target approach, as opposed to the sort of balancing. You can set fire to some tyres in a field over there as part of your process and then plant some trees over there. The science-based approach simply says don't burn the tyres. And MER score very highly on that basis. So I think it's ignoring the sort of rent and the kit that goes in the ground. It's partnering with someone that is here for the long term and look at their either experience in Europe and other locations and what their driver is. Are they just getting a pour on the ground, creating a network and selling it in the future to maybe one of the big oil companies? So that, I think those are the bits that you need to that will differentiate your decision-making process in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you for that one. Tim, I think this might be one for you, and it's something we briefly touched on about equipment becoming outdated. So somebody's asked the question that landlords are concerned about the potential of tech installed becoming outdated quickly, as well as the idea of wireless charging. So does this make, or will this make, current EV equipment redundant? What are your thoughts around that?
It's a good question, and again, not wishing to sell, but something that I think is really key that we do within our contract is we actually replace the hardware at year 7. So as I mentioned, I think we're sort of surpassing now this total obsolescence piece. There might be a requirement, again, depending on when the charger was installed. So if I put this into 2 segments, if we talk about what's been installed in the past, we are looking at, in the times that we've actually bought sites, because sometimes single sites are up for sale, we buy them, it's got a 50 kilowatt charger on it, we look to try and upgrade the connection where we can, and we put a faster charger in, but actually the connections on that charger will be exactly the same as they were on the 50 kilowatt. So that from that perspective, it's still doing a job. It could just potentially do the job better if we feel it could be a faster charger in that area. As I mentioned before, when it comes to growing out the installation, if you look at a CPO that has the ability to simply swap the charger out easily, we do that because of the way in which we install them. You can just about see it in the pictures. If you look very closely in the top 2, you can see that there is like a small area that's been concreted around it. That gives us the ability to effectively disconnect, pull out and replace the charger with a newer one should it ever get damaged or need to be replaced. But again, the sockets and the output hasn't really changed. So I don't think that's too much of a concern now for landlords. I feel we're past that point, and a lot of these charge manufacturers now understand that there might be a complete move away from CHAdeMO. So there is the ability with all of the chargers in this picture to be able to disconnect the cable, put a new gun on. So if you've got, for example, the top left, I think there's 8 bays, 7 of them are the CCS connector and 1 of them is a CHAdeMO. If that connector ever comes to an end, we can simply replace that cable with the gun. And if we go back to what Jason mentioned about the fully funded model, if it's from a fully funded perspective, we or your CPO would cover that cost for you. So they would just go, look, it's no longer in use, and they'll come and replace it as part and parcel of their maintenance. Touching on wireless charging, I do believe may have a place. At the moment, the cost of it is very, very high, and it's very limited to how fast it can charge. So it's limited to an AC perspective. I think the fastest out there at the moment is about 6 kilowatts. And to put that into context, that's about 25 miles of range for every hour of charge. And you need to have a 2-way system. So BMW do it, and I think taxis can do it, but you have to, you either purchase it from BMW from the factory, you can't retrospectively fit it, so you have to pay for that option, because basically it puts an induction plate and connects that to your battery. They can retrospectively do it to taxis, but then you need to put the charging infrastructure into the ground. So if you consider top left picture, we dug a channel roughly from where the bollards are to the hedge line. We dug a very deep channel and put everything in there. If you put wireless charging in, you're digging all the way out to the start of that charging bay, because you need to make sure the car, wherever they're parked in that bay, is over the wireless charging pad. So the installation cost is very, very high. So at the moment, the only place I've seen it being used in real world scenario, which I thought that's a brilliant idea, is taxi ranks, because naturally they're in that line all the time. And some days they're sat there for a long time. So it's great for them to get a small top up, But again, depends how long they're parked there. If they're there for an hour, that's a long time for them with no business, and they've only gained 28 miles of range, provided they've got a totally clean wireless connection from underground. So it is there. We're keeping an eye on it, but for the minute, and we have actually got one up in our concept office that we're trialing, but it's a very slow method, and it's probably better suited for potentially people without off-street parking, where they're parallel parking outside their house. But again, big cost for a council to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick addition onto the kind of the tech demand side. So another one's just come in to ask about whether we think there's still a real demand for fast charging, so the 7 to 22 kilowatts, and are people all looking now for the rapids with kind of 50 kilowatts and above?
Great question, and it comes up a lot because it depends on where your mindset is. And the reality is, yes, there is a demand for fast charging. That fast charging is ideal for your staff, your home, as Liz said, potentially cinema. Public fast charging, less of a space for it now, I think. But where it does work pretty well, and we see it working well, is actually local authorities, where there's if you're in a highly populated area that has limited off-street parking, with car parks that are available 24/7 that don't have a charge, let's say between 6 and 9, so somebody can park there overnight and charge their car. That's where we see really good usage for AC charging. So there is definitely a place for fast charging. You wouldn't want to live off of rapid charging. Again, it's a different mindset from refueling your petrol and diesel. Try and move out of that thought process of, I just want to stop, refuel and leave. Because at the moment, if you consider your petrol diesel car, I always say it in the same way, you're looking to go from A to B via D, because I'm going, well, to make my destination, I have to go totally out of my way to this place, fuel up, spend 5 to 10 minutes there before I can get on my way. With electric vehicles, you're going, it's sat in my driveway from 7 p.m. when I'm done, when I've picked the kids up, been to the gym, and I'm ending my day. It's in my driveway. I might as well plug it in and let it charge. Okay, it's charging slowly, but I'm not going to need it before 7 a.m. tomorrow, and I can therefore charge my car. So there's often people are leaving with a bit of charge in there, or if I'm at work for that time, it'd be great to have an AC unit. So there is definitely a place for AC charging. It's not retail parks though, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah. So Jason, I think one for you here. It's been mentioned that we were talking about maximizing income for landlords. What is the current market bay rent and revenue share currently?
I would say the average is between £3,000 and £4,000 per bay, and the market share is between 10 and 20%, and a variation between those depending on location and the charging opportunity.
Yeah,
very broadly.
Yeah, very broad.
In isolated locations, that can be £1,000 a bay. That's what works. And in other locations where it's incredibly high levels of vehicles passing each day, we've seen rents go well beyond those levels. Are they sustainable is the question.
Yeah. So I think we've got quite a few questions here about sites really. So let's touch on some of those. So somebody's mentioned that some of their clients have issues with flexibility across their estates. Do you ever have issues with exclusivity, and what is your view on this as an operator?
Good question. So just to really quickly answer this so we can try and get through as many of the questions. So exclusivity, yes, we do ask for it. In some circumstances, we step that down to what we call first refusal. So because we can offer both DC and AC charging, we would ask that you come to us first before you then search the market. If you're taking a retail park as an example, if you're putting in DC charging, it's very unlikely you're going to want a competitor on your site because it will end up diluting both. So you would probably want to sit with one DC partner. But we understand that normally the concern for this when we dig into it is, I have a retail park, I own the land, but I've got tenants. What if those tenants wants to go and sort out EV charging for their staff? Well, again, we can ring fence and separate AC charging, which then allows for your tenants to go and talk about AC charging to somebody else if they want to do it for their staff, and it's a behind the fence setup, so it's private for them in their back car parks. That's not a problem. But again, we can also offer on that as well. So we would allow that that ring fencing, but also come to you and say, hey, actually we can help you with this, and as we're partnering with you over here, we'll probably be able to do a pretty decent deal because we'll have our engineers on site anyway. So yes, we do ask for exclusivity. It is pretty standard in the market. Most will ask for exclusivity. It's unusual you'll see two operators in the same space. If you do, you'll normally see it be Tesla and another, because again, talking about service stations, for example, Tesla have been there for a very, very long time, and then you have an old school contract that is coming to an end with another operator for other vehicles.
Yeah, and that's kind of covered another question that we had that came in that looked at kind of why do we always look to secure exclusivity, or is competition a positive? So I think we've kind of covered that one as well, which is good. Going on to staying on the subject of sites. So we've got a question asking, what challenges are you facing finding sites for EV hubs within the M25, and how are you overcoming these? I don't know who's best placed to answer that one.
Sorry, Chris.
I don't know who's best placed to answer that one.
I think the challenges for finding sites, it depends what sort of sites you're talking about. If you're looking at sort of roadside hubs as opposed to a destination hub, such as a retail and leisure park that's already there, if you're looking to develop a network of an EV charging hub plus drive-through, is purely the cost. And inside the M25, the cost of land competing with alternative uses is prohibitive at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think also, certainly when we're looking at inside the M25, this comes down to whereabouts is it located, because if we're talking specifically trying to get drivers off of the M25, then it's very specific what we're looking for. It needs to be off a junction really close. Consider it yourself. If you're doing a long journey on the M25, how far off of that do you want to go to put fuel in your car? If we're on a junction where you get to the junction around the roundabout and then it's there, like we see traditional services in the UK, or are we trying to pull people, once we really get, I would say, half a mile or more of a drive from that junction, it becomes, we're no longer looking at the M25 as pulling drivers. We're then looking at the local area and how many drivers do we see. One of the big factors in this is about traffic count. And as Jason has learnt, tire fall, which is a great term in the EV industry. How many vehicles are we likely to see stop at that? So yeah, always interested in some land in and around that area, but there are a lot of challenges. It's almost as challenging being too close to a motorway without the access to it as it is just being away from motorways altogether.
Yeah. Sorry, Jason, another question's just come in asking us if we can circle back on the average revenue share. 10 to 20%, is that just for DC or is that for AC as well? And is that joint or fully funded models?
Probably one for you, Tim, isn't it?
I'm happy to take it. Yeah. So that typically speaking, it's DC. So rapid charging, just for clarity, AC charging. To be fair, in the industry, there are people that will look. There are CPO operators that will do funded AC, but it is a market standard that the return for that is very, very low, and that's purely down to the logistics of how much electricity you can pass through an AC charger. It is very slow, so because you can't get a lot of energy through it, its value is a bit lower. Whereas DC, because we're looking to obviously turn the customers over, we make it through the drivers using the charger. So that's where we can look to do more attractive offers to those landlords. And again, as Jason said, depending on where it is, will depend upon what we can offer. That revenue share will change depending if it's a fully funded or hybrid model. If it's a hybrid model, we can either look at a shorter term with a similar revenue back from us, or we can look at our standard term and we could go for a higher revenue share because you've got vested interest. But as Jason said, when you start to look at the details of that, because there's from a landlord's perspective, there's always this interest of having skin in the game and wanting to invest in it. But when you then look at really what that investment looks like versus the return, we typically see 99.9% of the time landowners just go, I'll go with a funded model because it means it's a hands-off approach for me as a landlord, and I'm still seeing some revenue coming from that.
Mm-hmm. And a question on the back of that is, what are the entry-level financials you need for each funding option?
In terms of, get some clarity on the question. So is that in terms of from the landowner themselves?
Oh, right. It's from Paul. So Paul, if you can hear me, if you could just clarify that for us, and we'll circle back to that in a second. I'm very conscious that it's 12 o'clock and I don't want to run too far over. But there is another question just there while we're waiting to say, are there any consequences to charging on DC largely rather than AC in terms of the kind of effects on the vehicles and their batteries? Now, my understanding is that we're still very early in the EV journey in terms of battery lifespan, etc. But I don't know whether, Tim, you could expand on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Chris. We are still very early. One of the things that's worth pointing out, all CPOs and the vehicles themselves will encourage you to stop DC charging at 80%. And there's two reasons for that. One is to protect your battery. And the other is simply because the charging pace really falls off after that point. If you haven't done it before, hire an EV, drive it till it's about 10 or 5%, depending how brave you feel. And the longer you drive it, the closer you'll get to zero. And then take it to a rapid charger and see the difference for yourself. You will see it in your things like iPhones or your mobile phone. But do remember, because a lot of people compare that, your phone is a single cell. So you see that degradation very quickly because one cell is taking all of the weight. When you're talking about EVs, we're into thousands, if not tens of thousands of cells. So the degradation really is minimal. So just to give you an insight, my car's done 25,000 miles. I am a mix of AC to DC charging, and its current battery, because I looked at it before this call, wondering if this would come up, is about 99.7. So it's the degradation's been minimal over 25,000 miles. And there's, as there is with petrol and diesel cars, there's cases where cars break as they roll out the dealership, and there's other people that will tell you they've had their car for 300,000 miles and it's never gone wrong. We're seeing exactly the same with battery vehicles, but the sort of main sway in this industry is that no, it doesn't really have an impact on the battery life.
Okay, so I think we'll finish this because we've had a reply. So we'll probably answer this one as the kind of the last question for the day. So he said that I'm assuming that there is a financial break-even point or a minimum return for a site from our perspective for the fully funded perspective.
Yes, there is.
Right.
So we would run all of that before we even came to you with an offer. So we would come and talk to you about who Mayor are and what we do and what we think would be a good idea for you and your site. And then we would take away those details and we do desktop analysis and we have modeling that we can run it through based on what we know about the typical installation cost. And then we'll come back to you and go, yep, it works. I can tell you from experience, retail park, anything with a decent traffic count, you're 90% of the way there. So it's yes, there is, and it does differ from site to site, because if we're talking about a site that's got 10,000 cars, the threshold in terms of our cost is quite small. If we're on the M25 and we've got 70,000 cars passing, the site could cost in the millions and it would still be really viable and a good idea for us. So it would come down to the site itself.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Well, I think it's been a very good session, and I think the questions that have been put in by the attendees today shows that we've kind of stoked interest and kind of brought to light some of the questions that need answering in the process of EV charging hubs and whether they are, a viable option for landowners. I'd like to say thank you very much to Jason for joining us today. I know you're a very busy man. And obviously to our Mayor team of Elizabeth and Tim, thank you so much for your valuable input today. It's very much appreciated, all of you. So next steps really are now that we will have this video put up online if you want to watch it back again, if there's anything that you want to recap or go over. And obviously you can get in touch with us at any point via our email address. And we also have information on our website, and we'd be happy to answer any further questions that you had. So please do get in touch with us one way or another, and we will endeavour to answer any of the queries that you have. But all that remains to be said really is thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you joining us and taking the time out. And hopefully we will see you again in a future webinar. Thank you, everybody.